Hello, everyone. I am Kimberly Merritt, the Assistant to the Executive Director, Mr. John Corkin. We'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar. We have a wonderful program for you today by Mr. Claude Graves that is titled Ramblers, the Majestic Giant Roses. But before we get started, we do have Mr. Gary Chen that will go over some instructions for the webinar today. Gary?
Hi there, this is Gary Chen. I'm currently the president of Sierra Foothill Rose Society. And as Kim mentioned, today we have a wonderful program by Mr. Claude Graves III entitled Ramblers, the Majestic Giant Roses. Following Mr. Graves' program, there will be a 30-minute Q&A session. And if you attended some of the recent webinars, you know what we'll be doing, the process. So what you'll do is raise your hands, I'll unmute you, and you go ahead and ask your question, and then Claude will answer your question. And I'll return this back to Kim, who'll give the bio about Mr. Graves.
Thank you so much, Gary. All right, so for those of you that don't know Claude, Claude is a member and former treasurer of the Heritage Rose Foundation. He is a member of the American Rose Society and chairman of the American Rose Center Committee in Shreveport, Louisiana. He's a four-time president of the Collin County Rose Society, twice president of the Dallas Rose Society, and twice president of the Dallas Area Historical Rose Society. Claude is currently the rose consultant to the Dallas Arboretum and is the garden's curator in the Chambersville Heritage Rose Garden and Belevi Rambler Rose Collection in McKinney, Texas. He is a co-author of the Earth Kind Rose Manual and has been awarded the American Rose Society Silver Medal and Outstanding Consultant Rosarian Award by the ARS South Central Deep District. He was awarded the Klima Gold Medal in 2021 by the American Rose Society for excellence in the field of horticulture education concerning the rose. He is also the recipient of the Mary Johnston Award. For the last 6 years, Claude has been the participant in the Battling Rose Rosette Research Project and is a leader in the effort to educate the gardening public about best management practices to deal with Rose Rosette virus. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Claude Graves.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim. It's a real pleasure to be presenting this to everybody today. I love to talk about my passion, which are these giant majestic roses, as indicated in the title of my speech. And trying to format exactly the way I wanted to present this program today, I thought that it might be of interest to kind of go back and review how I became so infatuated with these magnificent roses. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start off taking a little journey on how I became so involved with these beautiful plants. When we moved back to Dallas from Colorado in 1994, I'd been a member of the Rose Society in Durango, the Four Corners Rose Society. Was a consulting rosarian, at that time appointed by the district director. We joined the Dallas Rose Society, and there was a offshoot group of the Dallas Rose Society called the Dallas Area Historical Rose Society that really concentrated on heritage roses, and we became very involved with them. The first year, we went down to Mike Shoup's Antique Rose Emporium in Brenham, Texas, for his annual fall festival. If you've never been there, you need to put that on your bucket list, assuming with COVID being gone that he starts having them again. We went every year since 1994, except the COVID shutdown years. There I became more acquainted with these giant ramblers, and you can see in the pictures here, he was growing some ramblers on these tall posts with the ship hawser structure. And I was fascinated by that and had always kind of enjoyed climbing roses. Over the next few years, we started growing more roses in our home. I particularly love the climbers. And with my new interest in heritage roses, we immediately got into growing a lot of noisettes, which do well in our climate here in Texas. And you can see some of the examples. I had 30 large climbing roses encircling our backyard on a similar structure to what you see here. My first real experience with Ramblers was when we attended the International Heritage Rose Conference in 19, let me get this off my screen here. 1998 in Lyon, France. This is a map of France. You can see Paris up here. The conference was down here in Lyon, but there was a pre-tour to the conference to visit the little village of Grignon down here near Provence. And that's where I really got my first baptism into what these magnificent roses can do. The little village of Grignon, France is built on a hill that protrudes abruptly out of a fairly flat plain. In the 11th century, it was a fortification on top of this hill, a little chapel up at the inside the walls of the old fort. A village grew up around the base of the fort. It's actually a commune, and the Roses Anciens in France and the French government, through a cooperative effort, established a collection of rambling roses in the surrounding, in the little town surrounding the town, and this spiral road that went up from the base of the town up to the gates into the chapel at the top through the old fortification. That on the left side of the screen, you see one of the more magnificent roses there, Rambling Rector. In my opinion, there's nothing more beautiful than roses growing on stone walls. This was the absolute epitome of that. On the right, you can see the picture of later with my involvement with the Ann Belovich collection at Chambersville. You can see an example of Rambling Rector in our garden at Chambersville with a close-up of the bloom. Unfortunately, these early experiences were pre-digital photography, at least for me. And so some of these photos are scanned from the old 35mm slides, but hopefully the modern digital pictures will help to give you a better idea of what the roses looked like. This is another shot in Grignon. This is down in town with the people park on this little road that winds right around and goes up to the top. This is Thelma, a 1927 Hybridizers by Easley. And you can see what a magnificent rose it is. I will talk a lot about how tough these roses are and what all, and it's probably the best example in the world is look at where this rose is growing. The rose bed, so to speak, is a semicircle about 30 inches in diameter against a stone wall, which obviously has a deep foundation, and an asphalt covered parking lot. And look at the size and beauty of the rose that's growing out of that pretty extreme condition. So when I say these roses are hardy, I mean they are hardy. Again, they are just a one step away from a species rose, so you would expect them to be hardy. Moving on through Grignon, here is the Garland, beautiful white hybrid sempervirens, 1935. On the right is the Chambersville version of the Garland growing in Texas. Long John Silver, one of my favorite roses still today. It's a Horvath hybrid satigera rose, and we grow quite a few of the hybrid satigeras. Horvath, that we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail later, had his famous Pirate series of roses, Long John Silver being the first of those. Well, excuse me. Yeah, I believe it's the first of those. And all of those roses are of Hybrid Satigera vintage. The most spectacular rose at Grignon that made the most indelible print in my memory was this City of York, classified by the ARS, I guess, as a large flowered climber, and considered it a rambler. I'm so infatuated with this rose, I grow it at my home now in Dallas area. And I consider it definitely a rambler. It does not rebloom to me significantly at all, but it does put on a magnificent show in the spring with that first bloom. When we moved on up to Lyon and attended the conference, we had the opportunity to visit the home of Odile Mascaillet, who was at that time the president of Roses Anciennes in France, the French rose organization, Heritage Rose organization. She was a co-sponsor of the presentation over there of the conference, and we had this chance to visit her home. She lived in a magnificent home on a hillside overlooking the city of Lyon. The entrance to her home was through a glorified alley where was both a garage entrance and was a gate into her property, pedestrian gate. People stacked up like a wreck on a freeway going through that gate, because when they stepped through the gate, this is what they saw. The servants' quarters and garage adorned by this spectacular wedding day, Stern 1950 rose. It's an Alshire, I believe. And it was a spectacular, caused quite a traffic jam at the gate trying to get into the property there. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of wedding day at Chambersville. We had the rose. Unfortunately, we lost it to Rose Rosette Disease. And it's one of the roses in the Anne Belevich collection at Chambersville that we will need to be replacing, because it is such a world famous and widely grown rose around the world. It needs to be represented. This is a picture of wedding day on the famous rose fence at Santa Clara University in California. Seagull is the large white rose that you see here in Odile's home. There's two different views of the same rose. That's her house, covered by a climbing rose that was not in bloom at the time that we were there, and I'm not sure what that variety was. Here's a picture of Seagull in our collection at Chambersville, St. Alshire. Beautiful, beautiful rose, magnificent white bloom with the brilliant gold stamens. After the conference, Pam and I spent a few days in Paris, and we're looking forward to visiting the famous rose gardens around there. Unfortunately, we timed it and hit a public works strike. The buses weren't running, the trains weren't running, the taxi cabs, you couldn't get one because everybody was trying to get a cab. So our touring of the Paris area was pretty well limited to walking distance around the hotel. Fortunately, the day before we were going to leave, the strike was over, and we were able to had to pick one garden, so we parked the Bagatelle and went out to Bagatelle. Some pictures from Bagatelle. That's my wife Pamela under an Alberic Barbier 1900 Wischeriana climber. One of the probably most popular ramblers, I guess, in the world, grown extensively in England and pretty much all over the world. The most impressive Alberic Barbier that I ever saw was in Ninfa Gardens in Rome, in Italy, about 60 miles out of Rome in Italy. The docent on our tour through there said that this magnificent rose is one rose of Alberic Barbier at Ninfa. This is Apple Blossom by Dawson, a 1999 multiflora. We're back in Park Bagatelle. You can see Apple Blossom on the right-hand side of the screen at Chambersville, filling one of the towers. This is one of the large-size towers we had at Chambersville. It's a 10-foot diameter ring on the top. Wilchenblau, another rose that's very popular around the world, probably one of the most widely grown ramblers in the United States is probably Wilchenblau. It's a 1909 multiflora. Again, photographs at Chambersville. This is a Wilchenblau being grown basically as a shrub because I didn't have a tower available to plant it on at the time. So I just stuck it in the ground and let it grow as a shrub. And it makes a nice shrub until it would reach a point that it was getting too big to leave it in that condition. One of the most beautiful Wilchenblaus I ever saw was in Frida Hunter's garden in Amberley, New Zealand. This was a number of plants, but it was spread out over a long arbor and was really a spectacular sight. Another one of those indelibly etched into my mind. Back in Bagatelle, Francis E. Lester and the Francis E. Lester in our gardens at Chambersville. This is one of the roses on the secret garden fence at the American Rose Center. Auguste Gervais, Barbier. We saw a picture a while ago of Long John Silver. I have a group of large white roses that in my own mind I kind of call the great whites. This rose probably deserves to be in that mental collection of wonderful big white roses. It makes a beautiful bloom, contrasting the golden stamens with the pure white. This, as it is grown in Chambersville, and you saw it also being grown in Bagatelle. In 2004, when I was the treasurer of the Heritage Rose Foundation, we had a joint conference with the Heritage Roses group at El Cerrito at their annual celebration of roses. And this was probably the epiphany of learning about ramblers for me. The agenda on at that conference included a visit to the San Jose Heritage Rose Garden, a visit to the Rose Fence at Santa Clara University, and Ann Belovich was presenting a PowerPoint presentation on her Rambler collection. I had been to San Jose Heritage Rose Garden 2 years prior at the American Rose Society convention that was held there, but it was marvelous to be there again 2 years later and to see what were the small little roses at that time of the garden's first dedication, to see the growth of the roses as it's matured over 2 years for this visit. So this reinforced a lot of my interest in the roses. Tom Liggett, that collected the roses for the Heritage Rose Garden there at San Jose, also collected quite a number of climbing roses, probably over half of which were ramblers. There was no space for our funds for structures for growing these climbing roses, and they finally negotiated a situation with Santa Clara University to plant these roses on the new steel fence that had been built around the campus. And this is really a magnificent spot to see a lot of great roses. This is Chevy Chase, a hybrid Soliana, a very, very popular rose. I remember when I showed up at the conference at El Cerrito, there was a Chevy Chase, probably about 6 or 7 feet tall, in a pot sitting by the entranceway. And it's another one of those roses that is indelibly marked in my mind. That single one beautiful rose in full bloom right there at the entrance to the site of the meeting. These are a few other shots from Santa Clara University. This is Newport Ferry, 1908 with Shuriana on the fence. This is at a gate location of the fence. Baltimore Bell, a feast, 1843 hybrid Satigera. This is one of the earlier Ramblers. We're going to look at some of the dates on the Ramblers in a little while, but this is real early in the development of the Ramblers. Feast was ahead of his time, and he was using Rosa Satigera, as many of the early hybridizers did. After that conference, I was pretty well infatuated with Ramblers, infected with them, if you want to say. A few other trips in the preceding years to England, visits to Montesfont Abbey, where they have that magnificent leaky fund, Paul's Himalayan Musk at Hidcote Manor, probably the biggest Rambler I ever saw anywhere. And I've seen some large roses. This rose not only filled one tree, it filled 3 trees, and that was one plant. May Queen at the David Austin Garden, the display garden, along with many others. He has a very nice collection of Ramblers at his display gardens. And then Townsend Schoen at St. Albans, the gardens of the Royal National Rose Society. So all of this had me pretty well primed when I was at a meeting at in the Heritage Rose Garden in Shreveport with Stephen Scaniello. We were working on the Heritage Rose Garden over there. And Stephen casually mentioned to me that Anne Belevi was looking for someone to replicate her collection of roses. She was getting elderly and realized that she had to be thinking about what happened to her collection eventually, and she was looking for someone to try to replicate the collection to protect the work and the money that she had poured into developing this marvelous collection. I began a conversation with Anne, and in 2010 we actually began receiving some cuttings from Anne for gardens at Chambersville. And over the next 3 years, Anne took cuttings of her 350 Ramblers. She would send them to Malcolm Manners at Florida Southern College, and he had his students, graduate students, use those for practice in their training there. And he would root them out. Late in the fall, he would ship them to me, still in the liners, to Dallas. I had built a cold frame in my backyard, and I would overwinter the Ramblers in the liners in the cold frame. Then in the spring, we would move them up to Chambersville, transplant them into 3-gallon pots, and grow them out for eventually being planted in the garden. On May 3rd, 2014, we dedicated the Anne Belevi Garden at the annual Rose Dango celebration we had at Chambersville. This is a picture from the dedication. This is my wife, Pamela. This is Dean Oswald, the owner of Chambersville. This is Anne Belevi, Stephen Scaniello, president of the Heritage Rose Foundation, and also the director of the Peggy Rockefeller Garden at the New York Botanic Garden. This is the co-owner of Chambersville, Carol Oswald, and of course that's me over on the left there, on the right. The Rambler collection at Chambersville fits right in. We have a large amount of Satigera growing wild on the property up there. So it's very fitting that we have the Ann Belovich collection in an area that grows abundantly the rose that was first used in some of the very early hybridization of the Ramblers. This is Baltimore Belle, a feast, 1843, again, right at the very beginning of the Rambler hybridizing. This is one of the those early Satigera Ramblers. Queen of the Prairies, a very beautiful pink rose, fades to a beautiful light mauve, as you see there. You'll notice in the picture on the right, just one distracting thing about Satigera Ramblers is they have a somewhat unruly growth habit. They have a few canes that want to get very long, and they just kind of unruly type growth habit that you got to kind of live with, but they can make very beautiful, beautiful plants. Let's kind of take a look at the Ramblers in the Ann Belovich collection. This is not intended to be a portrayal of Ramblers in general, totally, but just of the roses in Ann's collection. And this will kind of demonstrate the era and the timing of when these roses were so important in the rose world. If you look at the time period from 1825 to 1885, a period of 60 years, and this is the time that Feast was hybridizing those early Satigera Ramblers. There were only nine of the roses in Ann's collection come from that era. For the following 15 years, from 1885 to 1899, a period of 15 years, there were 29, excuse me, 29 new roses introduced. In the next 10 years, to basically 1910, there were 53 introduced. This was the greatest number of roses in Ann's collection during that time period. The following 10 years, from 1910 to through 1919, 41, then 34, and it's trailing off in 1930, 1939 to 26. Well, what happened in the 1930s? New Dawn happened. Dr. W. Van Fleet sported to a rose that got named New Dawn. That was the dawn of the reblooming climber, and with the dawn of the new reblooming climbing roses, the Ramblers started slipping into extinction. Best exemplified by the fact that in the following 10 years, as far as roses in Ann's collection, we've got 2 added during that time period. In the next 50 years till 2020, we have only 15 in her collection. Let's look at some of the important hybridizers. And these were the hybridizers that were extremely popular, and the numbers here indicate the number of varieties from that hybridizer that are in the roses that we have from Ann's collection. Geshwin leads the list at 22. Walsh, which was her favorite hybridizer of the U.S., and she had probably the largest collection of U.S. hybridized roses in the world in one location. She really tried to focus a lot on the U.S. hybridizers. She's 17, and Torbonne, France, and Van Fleet, Barbier, and Horvath are the double-digit numbers. And we will look at a few of these hybridizers in detail, and we'll look at some more of the roses per hybridizer and talk about some of the features and characteristics of those particular roses and the attributes of the hybridizer, what he brought to hybridization. And one of the real innovators and one of the real fathers of the Rambling Rose and of roses in general was Rudolf Geschwind. He was a forest meister, educated at the University of Prague in forestry. He started in 1852 working with the Hungarian Department of Agriculture. Growing roses was his hobby, but in his hobby, he hybridized over 140 rose cultivars. He achieved international fame. The most important thing he did with roses is he introduced for the first time in rose history a concept in breeding that was antithetical to the popular thinking at the time. At the time, the assumption was that if you took the two very good roses and you crossed those two roses, you would probably get a rose that was at least as good or better than either one of the two roses you crossed. Geshwin proposed not so. He said that is his reckoning that if you cross two really good roses, your odds of getting an exceptional rose or one as good as either one of the other two was still very low. And as all hybridizers know, that is very much the case. And he was actually the first one that started putting the principles of genetics into practice, although he did not know the term, and that technology was still long before being developed. But he was the forerunner in foreseeing that. Some of Geshwin's great roses are Earl Koenig, also known as Wathis Nunes. It's a hybrid multiflora, gorgeous rose. This is one of the roses that we will be putting in the pilot project at the Rose Center. Really a nice big rambler. Futaker Schilling Rose, a gorgeous rose. I sent photos recently for an article I wrote in the Heritage Rose Foundation newsletter about the ramblers in her collection. And I sent about 5 photographs of some of the lesser known roses in Ann's collection. I heard back from Anita Clevenger, and she said that none of their editorial staff had ever seen any of the roses that we sent photos of. And they were amazed at some of these. Futaker Schilling Rose was one of those. Geshwin's a hybrid Geisha, a multiflora, 1913, a beautiful red with stripes. Geshwin roses are of note, very different than many of the other ramblers. I can take someone totally unexperienced with ramblers and show them a little bit about it, and I can have them walking through the garden and telling me which one are Geshwin's ramblers. Basically, because the foliage is so much different. He used very, very, very hardy varieties of roses in his hybridization. And as a result, he developed roses that are very cold hardy and roses also that have a tendency to not grow as tall or as big as the other roses. If you're interested in growing ramblers, but you don't want to deal with a 25 or 30-foot monster that might eventually appear, you could go with the Geshwin roses. We have many of the Geshwins that never get to the top of even a 12-foot tower. So they would be suitable for small structures and smaller gardens. And they also have that winter hardiness. Josephine Ritter, a hybrid multiflora from 1900. Ernest G. Dorrell, a lot of pink roses. This slide I put in here is kind of interesting. It kind of shows you the progression in the technology and the art of hybridizing that Geshwin went through. The 1884 Geshwin's Norland Rose in the top picture, obviously a very old-fashioned looking bloom, not particularly organized as far as the petals and what all. It has that typical old garden rose look. Compared to 25 years later, Geshwin's Norland Rose number 2. Look at the advance in sophistication of the hybridization. The bloom of Geshwin's Norland Rose number 2 could easily be the bloom on a modern Floribunda or shrub rose. Jackson T. Dawson, famous at the Arnold Arboretum near Boston. They are currently trying to develop a collection of all of his original roses, which is a problem because many of his roses are out of commerce, or the rose in commerce is not thought to be the actual rose. This is true with many of the hybridizers, especially with Geshwin, who lost within 30 years after his death. Pretty much all of his rose collection was gone because his major patron that was growing most of his roses garden fell into disarray, and most of the roses were lost. So many of the Geshwin roses we're not sure were actually the original rose. Most of those we indicate with as in commerce. But Dawson, getting back to Dawson, he was best known for the fact that he was the first to use multiflora and Wischeriana as parents. When he introduced Dawson in 1888, it was one of the early hybrid multiflora roses. Probably the first to introduce Wischeriana hybrids, Lady Duncan and William C. Egan. This is William C. Egan at Chambersville. It's a cream, light, tight, with a light tint of pink, cream rose. Still a beautiful rose today. That's probably one of the first of the hybrid Wischeriana roses. This is the Rose Dawson, which was named from him. This is ours. I have it noted as AIC because there is some question as to whether this is the original Dawson or not. I had the good fortune in, I believe it was about 2015, 16, somewhere in there. We visited Carla Fenisci's garden in Italy on a tour of the Italian gardens. And Carla Fenisci's garden, he was collecting gardens aggressively during the heyday of the Ramblers. So he was growing Dawson in his garden. It is very likely an original Dawson that was planted at that time, and is probably true since it was planted during the era when it was actually in commerce. And that's a picture of it in the lower slide here. You can see that there is some difference in the coloration, which can be accounted for by other variants. These are roses at about the same stage of bloom. But the thing that stands out to me is the larger number of buds on the version of Dawson at Fenisci's garden as compared to what we have. Stephen Scanello was looking for a Dawson at Elizabeth Park. It is on their list of roses that were in that garden originally. On our visit up there a few years ago, we looked at, I tried to find Dawson and I couldn't find it. He has searched for it and we haven't found it. It's probably been lost from that garden too. Michael Henry Horvath, a hybridizer that I've gotten to know a little bit more about recently and have a lot more respect for. Some of the marvelous things he did in creating Ramblers and roses in general. He came to America. He was born in the Germany, Hungary area of Europe. He came to America in about 1890, lived in Mentor, Ohio. He was a forester, as was Geshwin. He worked at several large estates near Cleveland. He actually worked for the Cleveland Parks Department, and he eventually became a trustee for the American Rose Society. He was a good friend of Horace McFarland's and also of Dr. Van Fleet. He utilized the Satigira, as we saw earlier, in his Long John Silver rose in his Pirate series. This is the Long John Silver that we saw earlier. I saw originally at Grignon. Captain Kidd. This is probably the largest bloom of any rose in Anne's collection, at least that we have grown, and at least the way it grows in Texas. It has a massive bloom. That's probably at least a 5-inch diameter bloom. I was so enthralled with this rose, I planted it here at the house. And although it has huge blooms, it doesn't have very many of them. And it has that common characteristic growth habit of the Satigira of somewhat unruly. And this one happens to be also somewhat unusually large. So as much as I love that bloom, Captain Kidd is headed to the gallows in my garden this fall. We'll find something else that's not quite as aggressive and that blooms a little bit more. This rose we're really excited about. This is Jean Lafitte, a hybrid Satigira from 1924. This was actually his earliest of the Pirate series. I'm not sure if this rose existed in the United States before we received this version of it in Anne's last import from Germany, from Sangerhausen. The roses, after they came out of quarantine, she never had them in her garden. They were shipped directly to us at Chambersville. And this was one of the roses. Actually, we received a request from Will Radler for this rose. He wanted to use it in his hybridizing program, being with the Satigira heritage that so many of the rose breeders are interested in because of its high tolerance for Rose Rosette disease. Horvath also hybridized the famous pink roamer, very, very popular in England. It is said in England that when you see the pink roamer blooming over the garden wall, that you know that it is spring. Dr. Walter Van Fleet in Pennsylvania. Dr. Van Fleet was actually a medical doctor. He practiced medicine for 10 years, but he loved horticulture and he loved roses. He finally quit his practice as a doctor. He went to work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture at Glendale, Maryland. And he was a visionary, much in the same line as Geschwin. And you might say as Will Radler. And he came up with the thought that the most important thing in roses is hardiness and easy to care for. And he started creating varieties of roses that he referred to as dooryard roses. Again, using the same kind of techniques of Geshwin in using very hardy variety of roses. Walter Van Fleet was not real interested in the fame and fortune of hybridizing roses. Many of his roses were actually introduced after his death by his workmates at Glendale and in conjunction with the American Rose Society. When you look them up, you will find many of Van Fleet's roses were introduced by the Glendale Plant Station and the American Rose Society. Walter Van Fleet was a great friend of J. Horace McFarland's, and he was a great contributor to the American Rose Annuals for many, many years, wrote many articles, and that's why we are featuring a lot of Van Fleet's roses around the McFarland Plaza area at the Rose Center. This is Mary Wallace, one of his early 1924 Hybridizers, a beautiful big bloom, very heavily substance petaled, beautiful, beautiful rose. This is one of the roses we have on the 6 towers at the entrance to the American Rose Center. In Glendale, another similar rose, white, named for the Glendale agriculture station where he worked in Maryland. This was one of the roses that was introduced actually after his death, untimely early death. American Pillar. This rose always kind of fascinated me when I was first learning about ramblers, because I saw it everywhere in Europe. Almost every garden we visited in Europe would have an American Pillar in it somewhere. And yet I hardly ever saw it grown in the United States. The lone exception being at Longwood. When you go in the entrance plaza at Longwood, it's a circle, and that circle is surrounded by 25 pillars of American Pillar. Alita Lovett, another one of my really favorite Van Fleet roses. Van Fleet was the actually coined the phrase large flowered climber. He was a friend of J. Horace McFarland's, as I said, and he lobbied McFarland into the adoption of the name large flowered climber, as it was a marketing tool similar to what we went through recently with the Mini Flora rose situation. Van Fleet hybridized the Dr. Van Fleet, which is the famous rose that sported and became New Dawn. This is Van Fleet. The bloom and everything looks basically the same as New Dawn. New Dawn had the remontant or reblooming characteristic, which was the death knell eventually for the Ramblers. This is Dr. Van Fleet in the McFarland Plaza area at the American Rose Center, the entrance to the new Circle Gardens. This is Dr. Van Fleet on the matching towers at the entrance to that garden. This rose is not really a Rambler. It's in Anne's collection. I couldn't understand at first why it was in there until I saw it bloom a few times. It has the most amazing, magnificent, big bloom with these very soft, crepe-like petals, kind of wrinkled and crinkled up looking, has a nice fragrance. And the stark contrast of those beautiful, delicate looking blooms on the very rugged canes, strong canes, appearing more like a Gallica than anything else. It is a very unusual rose. It is the first rose that blooms in our garden every year. It'll bloom at least 3 to 4 weeks ahead of any of the other roses. So I think it's a valuable rose to keep in her collection. She obviously saw something in it, I guess, much as I have, that makes it a really worthwhile collection in the garden. Michael Walsh was probably Anne's favorite hybridizer. He also was one that moved to the U.S. from England or from Europe. He started gardening at the age of 12 years old, became the head gardener on an estate, and became a very well-known hybridizer. He was known for his work with the Wischeriana climbers. He bred quite a number of those roses. He had a very disastrous event with his roses when the railroad next to his nursery decided they were going to burn down an old building they wanted to get rid of. The building burned for 3 days. The story was that it burned his nursery down, and I think the reality is it didn't really burn the nursery down, but 3 days of the fumes and smoke from the toxic smoke from the burning the old railroad building, it killed all of the seedlings and many unintroduced roses that he had in his collection. So no telling how many roses he would have produced if he had not lost everything and had to start over at that point in time. This is, I think, my favorite of Walsh's roses, Excelsa, a beautiful red climber. Many of Walsh's roses are large clusters of small blooms, this one being a vivid red. We actually found this rose about 5 miles from Chambersville, growing in a ditch in a almost pure limestone. In fact, we steady named it the Limestone Rose for years before we didn't know what it was, till I finally got it in Ann's collection, and we recognized it as being an Excelsa. Was probably growing on somebody's fence many years ago up in Collin County, Texas. Debutante, a beautiful, very palest of pinks or white, big bloom, fragrant, a really nice rose. Babette, another one of the large clusters, small blooms of a deep pink, bright deep pink. This rose never really performed to its capacity for us because it was planted very close to a tree line, and it received way too much sun for a major portion of the day. It was definitely shaded too much, but it's still, when it blooms, it puts on quite a show. This is Minnie Haha and her companion Hiawatha, which is a true red. It looks exactly the same, except for the red coloration. Again, large, very vigorous roses that will pretty much cover any kind of structure you want to put it on. And America, a beautiful, pale, light pink. Unfortunately, this rose has a much different growth habit. It wants to be more of a shrub than a rose. A shrub with some support would probably be the best way to term it. It does not get very large. This rose in this picture was probably 4 or 5 years old after we planted it. And most ramblers have been way over the top of the structure at that time. And Lafitte, another rose of cup, very similar to Hiawatha. And Snowdrift, a large white, beautiful golden stamens, a spectacular rose in bloom. Not quite as aggressive a growth habit as some of the other of his varieties. And then Rene Barbier of France. He's usually credited as hybridizing with a Multa Wischeriana. He actually used a very similar trailing species from Japan, Rose Rosette, but it created basically the same kind of rose with the dark green glossy foliage. And Barbier was most known for crossing his roses, to create his ramblers with hybrid teas and teas to get the coloration and the large bloom from those hybridized roses. We talked about Albertine before earlier in the program. These are some shots of Albertine, one of his very most popular roses. Probably one of his least popular roses or known roses, it would be popular if it was better known, is Jules Lavishiere. This was one of those roses I sent in the photographs to the editorial staff at the Heritage Rose Foundation that they had never seen or heard of before. And it's one of my favorite roses in the collection. Alexander Geralt, we saw this rose, I think, earlier in the program here. That was August Gervais. But this rose is widely used in gardens around the world. It's a prolific bloomer, magnificent color, and I've seen this in numerous gardens in Europe. Francois Foucard, a absolutely gorgeous bloom, kind of a noisette looking bloom. I've seen these blooms just very, very quartered in the typical old rose fashion. Really, really nice yellow, light butter colored rose. Ferdinand Roussel, an extremely vigorous grower. It can get extremely large, and it will put on a real nice show with its bright, deep pink blooms. So, what is the future of the Anne Belovich collection? Well, the American Rose Center over at Shreveport in June of 2021, Dean and Carol Oswald, owners of Chambersville, agreed to donate a complete duplication of Anne's Ramblers to the American Rose Society to help ensure the preservation of her roses. At that time, I knew that Dean and Carol were contemplating that they weren't going to be operating Chambersville Tree Farms forever, and that we needed to be looking to pass on these wonderful roses to someone and somewhere that they could be taken care of, and this collection that could survive. We have accepted these roses at the American Rose Center. Thanks to the donation from the Heritage Rose Foundation, we have created a nursery, specially built based off of my 12 years experience of growing these roses. Due to the problems we had at Chambersville with Rose Rosette Disease, we had to keep a large number of backup roses at all times because we could lose roses in the garden instantly. So we've tried to maintain at least 2 or 3 backup roses of every variety. This meant that we had an inventory of 1,000 Ramblers that we had to maintain at all times. So we had a replacement available for everything. And we had a large size rose up to move immediately into the garden and didn't have to start over with a rose the size you see here. So this is a system that I developed for growing these Ramblers that has proved very, very effective. So we have this nursery now with a capacity of 230 Ramblers at the American Rose Center. I have a meeting next week in Shreveport with a contractor to start the process of converting this old fenced area into a nursery number 2, which will house another 120 roses, which will bring the capacity up to 350 roses that we can maintain and care for at the American Rose Center. We have a marvelous relationship with the Northwest Louisiana Master Gardeners. I did a presentation for them last January. We've developed a very good relationship with them. They're very excited about being a part of this preservation project to conserve these roses for posterity. We are in the process of training 30 of their members on the special techniques and procedures and policies of growing these ramblers in the nursery. This is not just a prunum type of rose maintenance project. They will be taking care of these roses and training them and pruning them as they grow. We're developing 30 trained people, out of which each month they can draw the number that they need for that month's work in the garden. This was my crew that we had up there at the last session in June. All right, I guess that was in early July. This is the so where do we go from here? With the moving of the Ramblers currently being rooted at Chambersville into nursery number 2 this fall, the first steps in saving the Anne Belovich Rambler collection is accomplished. We will have replicated all of the roses that we have remaining, which is probably about 300 at Chambersville. And we will be looking to get replacements for those that we have lost over the years to Rose Rosette, and most of the loss came from our 1,000-year freeze we had in 21, where practically all of our inventory in pots got wiped out. The Ramblers currently in the garden, we have 20 on towers in McFarland Plaza. We have 2 on columns in McFarland Plaza. We have 6 on towers at the entranceway. We have 9 on the fence in the secret garden. This fall, we're going to put in a pilot study project of 10 to 12 Ramblers on towers in the area of the New Circles garden. Those will be added this fall. This pilot program will give us the data to accurately project the economies of maintaining the Ramblers in the garden. We're going to take data on the time spent on taking care of the roses, so we will be able to accurately plan on what the requirements will be in the future to help us with budgeting possible additional new gardens. With this information, we can plan accurately and appropriately for that. But this is not the end. We have the Ramblers in the nurseries, and we will be taking care of them, and we will see what develops in the future. If you're interested in making donations to help us maintain these roses in the nurseries over there at the American Rose Center, you can donate by check to the American Rose Society at their address there. It's also on the website. You can donate by credit card. You need to call the American Rose Center and do that over the telephone. Unfortunately, you cannot donate by credit card on the website, as there is no ability on the website to specify that the donation be for the Rambler project. You can specify either one of these other ways that the donation will go only to supporting the Ramblers. And you just do that by putting the word Rambler on the check or when you call to make the donation. And that about winds it up. I'll be happy to answer any questions now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Graves, for a very informative program on Ramblers. We're going to go into a 30-minute Q&A. Raise your hand if you got a question, and I will unmute you and ask you to unmute, and you can ask your question. So Karen Macon, go ahead. I see you got your hands up, so go ahead, unmute and ask. Carol, you still there? Want to go ahead and ask your question? I've unmuted you.
Claude, go ahead and minimize your email.
Okay, is there any? I'm not.
Well, let's see. Susan Johnson, you have a question? Go ahead and ask. Unmute. I guess we're not having issues.
We're having a problem.
Yeah, looks like we're having issues unmuting. Go ahead and move on. Shannon Anderson, go ahead and ask your question. Unmute.
Gary, if no one can unmute, you can go ahead and just pull questions from the chat and just ask everybody to do it that way.
Yeah, looks like it. We're going to have to do it that way. One of the questions I saw come up was, are the Ramblers, do they have fragrance?
Many of them do. Some of them don't. It's just pretty much like probably the roses in your garden, unless you only grow fragrant roses. There are some that have marvelous fragrance. Many of them have a moderate fragrance, and then there are quite a few that really have no fragrance. So it varies with every variety. And it's with 350 varieties. I probably didn't mention that as much because it's kind of hard to remember sometimes which ones do and which ones don't. But it seems like a lot of the larger bloomed Ramblers do have good fragrance. There's a few like Neige d'Averell that have a fragrance that you can smell it when you're 50 yards away from the plant in the garden. I mean, it's just a magnificent, sweet fragrance that just almost knocks you down. So that they go from that extreme to roses that are kind of like some of the modern roses that have zero fragrance.
All right, let's see. Kathleen Dunn wants to know, are there any Ramblers you can recommend that take semi-shade, only 3 to 4 hours of sun daily?
Well, most of my experience with them is we're growing them pretty much in full sun, so I don't have a lot of experience with them, but they typically will get by in minimal amounts of sun. Remember that these are species roses, and species roses grow up competing with other plants for sunlight. That's why God gave them the climbing habit that they did, that they can outclimb their neighbor and get up and reach sun. That's why roses, when you plant your hybrid tea in the shade, it gets lanky and tall. It's trying to find sunlight. But these roses are great survivors. We have had examples. I mentioned Babette a while ago is one that has not grown real well for us because it's planted on the north side of a tree line, and with the way it's oriented, it does not get a whole lot of sunlight. When those trees foliate, they don't get a lot of sunlight, and those roses just did not do real well. So I would say that you probably would need 5 or 6 hours of sunlight for them to really perform well, unless there's the opportunity for them to get above the competition for the light, and then they'll go crazy.
All right, Cheryl Garrett wants to know, can you give a concise definition of a rambler?
Yeah, I kind of like Graham Stewart Thomas's definition, that it's a species rose crossed with another rose that is basically that's it. It's just that it's a species. That rose, that a good example would be that rose at the beginning of my presentation, that giant white rose that my wife and I are standing at the base of. There was a great argument among those on the tour in New Zealand to the identity of that rose. And it was thought that it was a seedling of Rosa Barnonii, which is common in that area over there. Technically, that rose would be a rambler. It's a cross between a species rose and some other unknown rose. But according to Graham Stewart Thomas, that would basically qualify it as a rambler. So ramblers are near species roses, probably just no more than 2 or maybe 3 at the most generations away from a species rose being half of the cross. And it's crossed with some other rose that gives it some other characteristic, be it the blooms or fragrance or growth habit or whatever. So they're basically the early first generations of crosses with species roses. And there's a wide variety. We just touched the surface of the different varieties of species roses that are used in hybridizing ramblers. A lot of these hybridizers got very creative, Geshwin and what all in particular, and tried many different types of roses. The Wischeriana and the multiflora, of course, probably at half of the so-called ramblers that made it into commerce are probably a percentage of those. And the whole classification thing got extremely complicated because somewhere down the line, they crossed the Wischeriana with the multiflora and came up with a cross between those two. Some think that that's what Turner's Crimson Turner's Crimson Rambler is. And so then you get roses classified as hybrid multiflora that look more like their hybrid Wischeriana and vice versa, and it's wild. Was part of the problem with the classification of these roses with the hybrid Wischeriana, and instead of just calling them all ramblers. But in my opinion, that's still very useful as a subclassification. You notice I still use it. I call them all ramblers, but I still use those subclassifications of hybrid Wischeriana or Soliana or whatever, because it is a very handy and very important descriptor of what the rose is.
All right, Bobby Reed states, Shreveport isn't all that far from Chambersville. Do you expect to have similar issues with Rose Rosette Disease at Shreveport?
Excellent question. It's exactly 200 miles from Chambersville to the Rose Center. I drive it a lot. There is a significant problem in Bossier City, which is the east side of Shreveport, the east side of the Red River that divides Shreveport north and south. There is a significant Rose Rosette problem in Bossier City. It is as bad as it was in Dallas 4 or 5 years ago when it was really serious here. The fortunate thing is that is on the east side by about 10 miles from the Rose Center. The prevailing wind from the south and from the west moves those mites away from the Rose Center instead of towards the Rose Center. That area was infected with roses brought in basically from the Dallas area or from other parts of the country with rosette, and that's how the Rose Rosette got started in Shreveport. We have very low incidence of Rose Rosette in the gardens at the Rose Center now. Maybe only one case, and that is suspect of whether it was Rose Rosette or not. There was one case reported the other day. We just removed the rose. We didn't get it tested, so we don't know. But we are fortunate in the fact that we are on the east side of the Rose Center. We have a lot of pine trees between us and Shreveport. With my experience with the Rose Rosette research, battling Rose Rosette research that was done with Dr. Wyndham and Dr. Byrne here a few years ago, one of the most effective things in the management program can be a mechanical barrier. They found that just using grasses around the garden, big tall muley grasses or pampas grass or something as a wall, so to speak, around the garden would greatly reduce the amount of Rose Rosette. So we have that working for us too, plus the fact that we're constantly monitoring it, and we will practice the best management practice of immediately destroying any rose that we even suspect may have Rose Rosette disease. I did talk a lot about the Ramblers getting Rose Rosette disease, but they didn't get it any worse than on any of the rest of our roses at Chambersville. I mean, they weren't more affected than were the roses in the regular heritage garden or in some of our modern rose display gardens at Chambersville. So we just had a big problem with Rose Rosette everywhere, as all of Collin County. At one time, Collin County was the most rose infected county in the country.
All right. Well, Anne Marie asked, are you asking who might have some of the missing ramblers? She states that they have over 30 odd ramblers that were purchased over 30 years ago.
Yes, we will be. I've just now developed a list, or am developing a list of what we need. I am in the process of rooting the roses, the last roses for the movement of the roses over to the American Rose Center. When these roses are in the mist bed now, when these roses are growing healthily in 3-gallon pots, I can take an inventory and see what I don't have. And at that point, I will have a list. I have been in contact with Teddy Moyer, who is Anne Belevich's daughter-in-law, which is taking care of what's left of Anne's collection, doing a great job of restoring some of her garden. A lot of the heritage rose people in the Pacific Northwest are working to maintain Anne's garden up there. So we do have a number of efforts going. I told Teddy the other day that I'll be sending her a list of the roses that we need. Hopefully we missed the bloom this year. but hopefully when they bloom next year, she'll be able to find and identify roses to fill in the collection. We would like to bring it up to as close as we can to what Ann's collection was. We have accumulated a few roses. I got some from Steve Jones and some other people that are growing ramblers. Great roses that we felt like needed to be in the collection that weren't in there. They're in Ann's book. They just weren't in the list of roses that she sent to us. Himmelsage and some comes to mind, and some of the other really nice roses. Paul Transon, we have Paul Noel that looks very much the same. Some people think they're the same. Some people think they're different. I have a Paul Transon now that I got from Steve Jones that will add into the collection. Roses that from knowing what Ann collected and did collect and would have collected fit in with what she was doing. But
Right.
yeah, we will be putting out a list and asking for help on getting us cuttings and what all. I have made, I will lose my facilities for rooting the roses when Chambersville goes away this fall. But we have a relationship developed with Steve Russell, hybridizer in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and he's agreed to root the roses for us down there now.
Okay. Chamina wants to know how far north from Texas can we have these roses in a public park?
It depends on the varieties. I think I mentioned a lot of the Geshwin Roses proved to be very winter hardy with us. We had Geshwin Roses in containers that survived when none of the hybrid Wischeriana or hybrid multiflora did. The only hybrid multiflora or Wischeriana roses that survived that were in containers were ones that we discovered had actually rooted out of the container into the ground. And the only reason they survived the freeze was because they actually had roots into the ground, and they were not dependent upon the roots in the pot freezing. But there are varieties that can be grown further north. I don't have experience growing them up there, but from what I saw from our freeze, where we had 3 days that it didn't get above zero in Dallas, which is extremely unusual for us. Most of the Geshwin roses weren't phased by it, so that'll give you kind of a clue of what you might look at.
All right. Angelica has a question. Some ramblers, do they rebloom?
You will get a rebloom on some. It's not a big deal. There'll be a scattered little bloom here or there on some of them, but there aren't any that really significantly rebloom that you get a really major flush of bloom on for a second time. Most of them are one and done. The nice thing is that many of them have a fairly long bloom period. Climbing American Beauty, for instance, that thing will bloom for almost a month for us, and it does extremely well, but then very, very little after that. But there are many of them that we'll put out. We have one rose that reblooms very well, but we found out that it is actually not the correct rose. It's actually a polyantha and not the rambler that it was thought to be. So that really doesn't count.
All right, Laura Dickinson wants to know, how disease resistant are they? Do they require routine spraying?
No. The only exception to that would be, well, we did spray miticide for rose rosette protection, but that has nothing to do with the disease resistance. There are, particularly some of the Walsh ramblers are very susceptible to mildew. If you live in an area that has significant mildew problems, I'm talking powdery mildew, not downy mildew, there are some varieties that have a significant problem with that. There have been, we don't usually have a big problem in our area with mildew, so we don't pay any attention to it. A few of the roses get mildew, and eventually when it gets hot, that problem goes away and they don't disfigure the roses too bad. We have had a couple of years where we had weather conditions where mildew became very significant, and we actually did spray the roses a couple of times over the 12 years to reduce the problems with powdery mildew. That's about the only significant. There are some of the roses that will show mild black spot problems. We didn't ever bother spraying for it. We just let them defoliate a little bit. When the weather got hot and dry, well, that problem would go away. So we really never sprayed the roses for anything other than an occasional situation with downy mildew. Powdery mildew.
All right. Barbara Thompson wants to know, how hard do you prune Ramblers?
Very, very hard. The biggest mistake we made when we started growing these roses was letting them get out of control. I had this grandiose idea of letting them get big and gorgeous and beautiful and hang down from the 12-foot tower all the way to the ground. And they were magnificent, but it became a nightmare to maintain them. They got out of control. You couldn't get to the base of the rose. Birds love to roost and to sit during the day up in the top of these ramblers and plant tree seeds all day long under them. And if you can't get to the base of that rose and keep it cleaned out and keeping the weeds and the little seedling trees out, you're going to end up with a nightmare. So we found out that the best way to maintain these roses is to prune them unmercifully. I had a good friend that when I was first learning about roses, he had a magnificent collection of tea roses in a very small, average residential home backyard. And I told him, I said, how in the world do you maintain this collection of tea roses in this tiny yard? He pulled out his pruners and he said, I only let them get as big as I want them to get. And that's the philosophy with the Ramblers. And it's actually the most economical way, look from the American Rose Center standpoint, of maintaining them. A routine hard pruning on them to keep them under control actually reduces the amount of labor that they're going to take significantly. You can lay off doing anything for months and months and not do anything on them, but then when you have to do something on them, it is a major, major job. So basically prune them hard. It's the same old story that you're not going to hurt it with too much pruning. The worst thing you can do is you're going to maybe lose a little bloom. I would really like to do a program sometime on how we prune these Ramblers, because there are a lot of half-truths and misunderstandings on pruning these once blooming giant roses like this. And I think these roses would be grown more if people really knew the best way to maintain them. Unfortunately, we have learned that over the last 12 years through experience and doing it and making all the mistakes. We had towers collapsing and blowing down because we let these things get too big. And we had to learn the hard way. That seems to be the way I learn stuff, but we had to learn the hard way on how to really keep them manageable with a minimal expense, because we were paying guys at Chambersville to work on these things and to keep them into shape. I did a lot of that myself for many, many years. So we had the same kind of problems at Chambersville that they have at the Rose Center on the concern for the manpower and the hours to maintain roses.
All right, the next, there are a couple questions that relate to differences between climbers and ramblers. I want to know if it's mainly genetics, and so Couple questions coming up. The distinction between the two of them.
Okay. Basically, when people today in the modern world, when they talk about climbing roses, they're almost always talking about reblooming roses. Either climbing sports of hybrid teas, climbing sports of other various and sundry different kinds of roses, or roses bred to be climbers. But they are really multiple bloom cycles per year. The Ramblers is a terminology that applies basically to the once blooming roses. These roses that were hybridized back in that golden era of the early 1900s. These were the only climbing roses they had back then. All of the great gardens of the world that you see old photos of and everything, and you see these marvelous big arbors and these climbing roses. Those were all Ramblers. That's all they had. They were these once blooming roses. It was amazing to me when I first started traveling a little bit and getting over to Europe. We had this, I had grown up and in roses, I wouldn't have a rose that didn't rebloom in my garden. You know, I had to have roses that rebloomed in flushes. That's what I was used to. That's what hybrid teas do. That same philosophy never really took place in Europe. They still appreciate the once blooming rose as much or more than the modern rose. Every major garden in Europe has a collection of rambling roses in it. And that once you get into it, you start to understand why. It's like you anticipate it. It's like the tulips blooming. They don't bloom but for a few weeks every year. Look at the time, energy, and effort you go into planting tulips. But you get this marvelous display once a year. And there's an anticipation leading up to it that makes it an event when they bloom. And like I say, this is respected in Europe to a much greater degree. When the Ramblers are blooming at La Haye or Bagatelle or wherever, the crowds increase significantly because they come in to see this spectacular bloom. We look at this at the American Rose Center, and one of the problems with acceptance of expanding Ramblers into the public gardens is this concept that they only bloom once. And what we have to build is an understanding that this would be an event type thing. At Chambersville, we built our Rose Dango, Bloom Dango celebration around when the Ramblers were blooming. It's almost like a Christmas in Roseland kind of thing. It would be an event-driven, short bloom period, but the bloom period is spread out. These things will start blooming. The earliest ones will start blooming in a typical year around the first in this part of the country. They will start blooming in late March, and then various varieties, they don't all bloom at the same time. Some varieties will start blooming in late March. Some won't bloom until almost into June, in mid-May or late May. So you actually get a fairly long bloom period. If you got a variety of roses, they don't all ever bloom at the exact same time, but you get a span there probably of at least 3 months where you've got some bloom in the garden.
All right. Denise has a couple questions. Have you considered selling rooted cuttings to raise funds? And does a written catalog exist for the collection? She collects Ramblers and Climbers.
No, we don't have any formal process of selling the Ramblers. That is a very viable thing to do, and it's something that I think we would certainly be looking at doing. Part of the reason of preserving the collection of roses is to keep these varieties available. And the best way to do that is to get them spread. We would like very much to not be the only person in the world or in the United States that had a particular rose. As we're finding out with the closing of Chambersville, that's a very dangerous situation for the rose. It may disappear. Ideally, we would like to have all of these roses spread out in mini gardens all over the country so that there's always one of them around somewhere to preserve those genetics for posterity. That's the whole concept. So anything we can do to more widely spread these roses, we don't have a selfish attitude at all of we want to be the ones that have this and you got to come to us to see it. We would love for them to be more widely used in gardens all over the country. But right now the situation is that somebody has got to kind of keep this collection together, and we're kind of assuming that role. But I would be happy to put some lists out of the roses that we have, and I think in the future we have sold. And what I have found with Chambersville closing down, what I have found is that people are willing to pay quite a bit of money for very large roses. I mentioned we had an inventory of 1,000 roses. Many of those got destroyed in the freeze, but not all of them did. With the anticipation that we're going to be closing down, any excess roses that we had in our inventory, we've started selling off. We actually had shipped some roses to the Washington, D.C. area recently, about 30 varieties of roses, and we shipped them all the way up there to a lady that was putting in a very extensive garden, and she wanted large ramblers. She wanted to buy roses that were already 8 to 10 feet tall. And I think that this is viable at the Rose Center. We will have to continue growing these roses out in the future, even if we start growing them in gardens. We will have to keep backup copies at the Rose Center as we would at Chambersville, particularly since there's the threat of Rose Rosette Disease, but there's the threat of other things. Lightning can strike one of those towers and no telling what. So we got to have a backup. If we take a rose out of the nursery and we plant it in the garden, we got to have a backup. And eventually the roses will get too big in the nursery to be able to maintain. They will get to be a problem. So at some point we have to dispose of the rose, root new cuttings, start a new little small rose, and we'll have to get rid of the big rose. Well, why not sell the big rose? And I anticipate that somewhere in the future we may have a situation where we have an annual event where we sell off some of this excess inventory, a plant sale, so to speak. And a lot of I know that the Dallas Arboretum, where I'm the rose consultant, they have a major plant sale every year. It raises significant money. And this would be something that I see we could do in the future in these roses. This is a couple of years off before the roses got that large that we'll be faced with the problem of they either got to go out and get planted in a garden, or they need to be replicated, rerouted, and the mature rose disposed of. Okay, well, I think I kind of rambled on that, but anyway.
Yeah. Speaking of last couple of questions, they're basically having to do with zone. Robert wants to know, in zone 5, how do ramblers do over the winter? James wants to know, he's in zone 4, and what ramblers are hardy in zone 4?
I'm really not the guy to ask in Zone 4. My experience with Ramblers has been basically in our climate here. But I know that there are knowledgeable rosarians up in those parts of the country. Get in touch with some people that are in the Heritage Rose groups up in those areas, or contact through the Heritage Rose Foundation or something, people that grow those roses. I would hate to make recommendations beyond what I have in generalities about the some of the roses that are hybridized out of Germany and Czechoslovakia and what all that are pretty cold hardy roses. That would be my starting point. But as far as you getting into Zone 4, that's really getting pretty cold. They would probably not ever attain a very great height up there. They may come back basically from the roots every year, but that's not really what you're looking for when you're growing Ramblers. So I don't feel qualified really to give a definitive answer to that question.
If I could jump in, this is Craig Dorschel. Elizabeth Park in Hartford, Connecticut has a lot of Ramblers growing on the arches. You've probably seen pictures of them. I think
Yes.
The bulk of them are Dorothy Perkins and Excelsa. There may be some American pillars in there, I'm not certain. But what they do is they wrap the canes with burlap over the arches for the winter. So they do have some protection. I would say Hartford is probably on the 5 to 6 zone line. So I don't know about Zone 4, but they do have them year after year, and they make quite a display around Father's Day each year.
Right. Thanks, Craig. I appreciate you stepping in there. Yes, I've been to Elizabeth Park, and Stephen Scaniello was involved very much with that garden up there. And I know that they have, like with Excelsa, that's the rose on most of those arbors. And they were beautiful when we were up there, I guess 4 or 5 years ago, when they were in bloom. So they can be grown. They would probably require some protection. It would seem logical based on our experience with our 3 or 4 days of a real Midwestern winter.
Well, we've gone beyond our 30-minute Q&A session. Kim, there was a question about when the presentation will be posted.
Yes, this presentation will be posted within the next week on our ARS website, as well as our ARS YouTube channel.
Yeah, great.
Okay. So Gary, did you want me to close it out now, or you okay?
Ask if Claude's willing to answer a few more questions. We can go on. If he's done.
Whatever y'all want to do, I'm willing. I don't have anything to do this afternoon. It's 100 degrees outside. I'm not going to go out and work in the garden. So.
Yeah, I'm in Northern California. We're expected to be 105.
Oh my gosh.
All right, so we'll go do a few more. Deborah wants to know, how often do you fertilize once blooming Ramblers?
Oh, basically, well, for a long time, we never fertilized the roses at all. Again, I go back to this cliche, I guess, too often, but these things are species roses, basically. And they're used to growing anywhere in any kind of soil. They seem to thrive in our heavily alkaline soil here at Chambersville. They seem to grow extremely well. They get fertilized occasionally now because at Chambersville, because we have a fertigation system, and we occasionally run a fertilizer dose through the fertigation system. But to actually just go out and deliberately fertilize the roses, we just don't ever do it with the Ramblers. We do with our other rose collections, but they're basically just growing in the native soil and our native clay soil. The original bed was amended with some organic material, and that's about it. We have drip irrigation system on them to ensure that they're getting some water. Actually, after about 3 years or 2 years in the ground, you could turn the irrigation system off. And these things are like trees. They're going to put down root systems. They're going to find the water somewhere down there. The only reason we maintained the irrigation system in the gardens was when we had to replace a rose. They do need, when we take them out of that little 3-gallon pot and we stick them out there in that environment with the extreme weather, they do need to stay, those roots need to stay moist. So we have to have the irrigation system so that any new small plants will get water for the first few years while they're getting established. But once they're totally established, we could turn the water off and it really wouldn't make much difference with the roses. So they're really not real dependent upon being watered, other than the first year for sure, while they're getting established. And then after that, they become self-sufficient. And the same with nutrients. I'm sure they would enjoy some fertilizer. With many of these roses, you really don't want to encourage them to grow too much more than they already want to grow themselves. This is, in many cases, you would probably be increasing your maintenance situation if you heavily fertilize the roses and got them too healthy.
All right. Lolan Song wants to know, how can she get more involved in your effort in addition to a donation?
Well, help us when we start advertising and trying to find some of these missing roses that we need in the collection, helping with that, and just the donations, of course, would be extremely welcome to make sure that we are adequately funded to maintain these roses as they need to be. We're in great shape now with the wonderful participation that we're getting from the Master Gardener group over there. But those are fragile situations. And I've been around long enough to know how volunteer work in rose gardens goes. I've been involved in a number of public gardens, and I know how the enthusiasm can wane. At some point in the future, it may be more difficult to get volunteers to do the work. But that's one thing we're working on at the American Rose Center, is to increase our amount of volunteer work in the garden. We've got to. Most all public gardens figure they need at least 25% of their routine plant maintenance to be done by volunteers. And we're a long shot away from that at the American Rose Center right now, and we've got to reach that kind of a number of volunteer help to really be on the path that we want to be on, to be a major garden in the United States.
All right, Martha Negley wants to know, are ramblers and climbers more susceptible to Rose Rosette?
I would say the answer is yes, but that is only from the standpoint of the fact that they are a bigger target. These things are floating in the wind, ballooning in the wind is the terminology that they use now, like a grain of dust. This little mite is floating along in the wind. And the bigger the plant, the greater the possibility that this little mite is going to blow into the plant. So the susceptibility to the disease has nothing to do with the genetics or the characteristics of the plant. but only with the size of the plant. The first thing that got wiped out in my home garden with Rose Rosette were all those 30 climbers I had around the outside. I had a huge screen up there that was just screening the mites out of the air and collecting them to destroy my garden. So it would have been fine if those had been Nellie R. Stevens hollies all the way around there, fencing my garden in. The mite can't live in the holly and would die. But unfortunately, they were all roses, and the mites could thrive in the roses and wipe out my garden. So from the standpoint of just sheer size, that's the only thing that makes them more susceptible to disease, is that they're a bigger target for the mites to find.
All right, Henry would like to know, Henry states he would like to display a rambler on a rebar tower shown in your slides. Would you know where he could find one?
Well, we're going to be getting rid of a bunch of them at Chambersville. Hopefully we'll be able to move a few of them over to the Rose Center. But we're probably going to be selling some of those towers at Chambersville. I don't know where she lives, but they would be difficult to ship or to haul unless you were in a reasonable distance that you could pick one up on a trailer. But I have plans for it, and I'd be willing to share those and send you a plan of they're just made out of rebar, and I've got like I say, a plan that anyone could have built by a local welder in their vicinity.
All right, Don Hetzler says, you mentioned some varieties have resistant to Rose Rosette disease. What do you mean by resistance, and could you provide a list of the resistant varieties?
That comment was in regard to the Rosa satigera hybrids. Rosa satigera has been found to be resistant, not resistance is the wrong word, tolerant to Rose Rosette disease. When Dr. Dave Byrne first got involved with the Battling Rose Rosette Disease project, or started that project with the Department of Agriculture, he visited our garden a number of times, and actually we rooted a number of the Rosa satigera that he used in his early experiments with Rose Rosette disease. And he found that the hybrids that he hybridized off of the Rosa satigera were quite resistant to Rose Rosette, and that is a rose that is very instrumental. We have a rose in the garden, Sargsy Europa. It is a satigera hybrid. It blooms with a kind of a refined, natural-looking hybrid satigera bloom, but a more refined and a denser bloom pattern and everything. A very nice rose. A number of years ago with Dr. Wyndham, we participated in some Rose Rosette research with Dr. Wyndham. Oh, heck of a time for an Amber Alert on my phone here. Sorry about that. We were doing Rose Rosette research with Dr. Wyndham, and I was sending mite count samples to him at the University of Tennessee on a bi-weekly basis, and we were doing mite counts on the ramblers to anticipate when was the best time to apply miticide for mite control. And I would randomly select roses each 2 weeks to send to him to do the mite counts. The highest mite count that he got on any sample I sent during that 1.5-year time period was off of this rose, Sargsy Europa. It was the highest count of mites on the plant of any sample I sent. And yet that plant had never shown symptoms of Rose Rosette disease. We tested the plant and it did not show positive for Rose Rosette disease. So it appears that it has a high degree of resistance to Rose Rosette. That I think that's what I was referring to about roses that are resistant. Dr. Byrne has used that and other genetics. I guess Rosa palustris has a similar history of not showing any Rose Rosette disease, and there are some other roses. Dr. Byrne's project, he's the Basie Rose Chair at Texas A&M, and is doing work on developing basically a new race of roses based on the genetics to try to come up with new roses that are resistant to, truly resistant to Rose Rosette disease. This is an ongoing project. Unfortunately, we have not gotten funding from the Department of Agriculture for 2 years now, so the project is pretty well died, but I know that Dr. Byrne is still pursuing this work. They did find 2 markers, genetic markers for Rose Rosette that they are aware of now, and the hybridizers are aware of this. And so we do have 2 markers that they can start looking for in hybridizing new roses. But in my experience, other than this experience with Sargsy Europa, about the only rose I know of that I could really say is to some extent resistant to Rose Rosette disease. The problem you have is a lot of times you see roses that don't show symptoms of Rose Rosette, but the problem is that they're asymptomatic. They get infected and they're producing mites and they have the virus in them just like any other rose, but they never show symptoms. A found rose called Caldwell Pink, many think it's the same rose as Pink Pet, has that characteristic here in Texas. Dean Oswald, the owner of Chambersville, his home garden got wiped out twice with Rose Rosette disease. Both times there was one rose in the middle of the garden, a big, beautiful Caldwell Pink that never showed a symptom. That rose was infected and it wiped out his garden twice over a 3-year period when they lost all the roses, waited a year and replanted and lost all the roses again. So you got to be careful about what you're talking about being resistant to Rose Rosette disease. It may just not be showing the symptoms. It may be asymptomatic and be infected as heck, and it may be wiping out your garden. Work is being done on that. Unfortunately, with the loss of funding, progress is pretty well stopped on that project for right now, other than just what they can continue to do. I know Dr. Wyndham was trying to continue doing research on his rose garden from hell in Crossville, Tennessee, where he has a whole garden of infected roses that Dr. Byrne takes his would-be resistant roses up there and plants them in that garden, and then we watch them and see how long it takes them to get Rose Rosette. So there is still a little research going on the side, but no big research because with the dollars just aren't there to do it now.
Well, you probably basically have answered this next question, but I'll go ahead and ask it anyway. Is there anyone working on a database to document, record these ramblers? And would it be worthwhile effort to share the information worldwide someday?
I'm sure there's a Help Me Find is a great resource, and there's a many of these roses are on Help Me Find, and that's a great place to start that already exists today. Modern Roses, I hope we can get more of these ramblers and what all into Modern Roses, and I think that's a great place to get this information. Those are the primary sources that I know of right now. I've got my own little database of the roses and trying to keep track of them as best I can in our gardens at Chambersville. But that's the extent of it now. There's some good books out there. Stephen Scaniello's Climbing Roses has got a lot of good information in it, and Climbing Roses of the World, Rehnquist or something is the guy's name. I think it wrote that book. Graham Stewart Thomas on old Climbing Roses book. So there is some information available on these roses.
Thank you so much, Claude, and thank everyone for attending today. We really appreciate you all showing us support, the American Rose Society. And please, again, the webinar will be available within the next week on the ARS website and on the ARS YouTube channel. Please look out for more webinars in your email box. And everyone, enjoy your weekend. Thank you, Claude. Thank you, Gary.
Well, thank you. Enjoyed talking to you about ramblers.
Have a great weekend.
A pruning video is much demand, and there are those that are asking for the plans on the rebar tower that you showed. So I guess somehow make that available or give an email at it where the folks can ask for it.
Yeah, I'll talk to them at the Rose Center and see if there's some way we can distribute that information on the towers on our website or with an email blast or something like that.
All right.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
All right. Thank you.